Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. Make sure you check out the podcast in the description below and my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac. Preface: I'm an avid hiker and backpacker. Most of the time I hike by myself and I sleep out in the woods by myself. I have a good amount of time in the backcountry, and up until this, I would actually have never claimed that I had any paranormal things. Not even remotely happened to me before. This past weekend, I set out for a solo hike in the Catskill Mountains of New York. When I arrived at the trailhead, two other hikers, not together, also pulled up. This area had no marked trails, so no landmarks really worth going to. So after some friendly salutation, the three of us established that we're actually quite similar to each other, and we decided to go up to the land together. Eventually, one of the guys fell behind, and after waiting for a bit, the other gentleman and I figured that he's changed his plans, so we push on. We summited two peaks together and then decided to extend the trip a bit in search of an 80-year-old plane crash. This is situated in a very rugged area in between the ridgelines of the peaks, so we decided to head there. I knew that people had died in the crash, but I have read about a number of plane crashes in the Catskill area at the time. I didn't remember the exact details of this particular relic, I just knew it was there. It's definitely a strange feeling going to a place where somebody took their last breath, especially in such a violent and panicked way. It's almost as though their energy doesn't leave, but besides, you'll feel a bit weird being there regardless and sympathetic. But it's a beautiful day, and we're gonna go there. Now my new friend and I silently walked to the wreck, taking pictures and video, being careful not to touch anything. Our individual wanderings had put us about 30 yards away from each other, and in between us is water drainage, so we couldn't really hear each other. Even if we wanted to talk, we actually explored in complete silence for about 20 minutes. I closed my camera, and as soon as my viewfinder snapped into the camera body, I heard a deep male voice say "nice shot." The best way I can describe it, as though the timbre of the voices was a compressed, amplified whisper, almost like Christian Bale's Batman, but with the more normal tone of a digital texture, if that makes sense. It doesn't sound remotely normal. The woods can do weird things to sounds, but this is different. I assume it's somebody walking up from another direction, half expecting to see the other hiker that we saw before. Now, we discussed the plane crash on our way up, so I thought it was him being cute. He's not there though. Nobody is, in any direction. My new friend is down by the ridge a bit, and he's busy framing a shot. By now, he's actually a good 40 yards away from me, and I ask him if he's seen something, but he hasn't. Now, to be honest, the real creepy didn't set in until about 10 minutes later. I just figured it was somebody's voice carrying from somewhere up the ridgeline above us, but as we made our way back to the more established herd paths, the more I thought about it, and the more creepy feelings creeped in. I distinctly heard "nice shot." I swore by it, but nobody was around. As we got back to easier ground, my new friend filled me in on specific details of the plane crash. 3 souls on board for a military training mission post-World War II, going off course in bad weather. 2 of the remains were never found. I never shared what I heard with the hiker friend. I don't think anyone wants to walk out of the woods with a total stranger spewing ghost stories. Honestly, I feel like there's gotta be an explanation, but I just can't get over the "nice shot" part so close to my camera, having no one around me. It's midsummer in New England, and my best friend and I, let's call him Andy, and I are hanging out. I live on conservation land, so aside from the houses at the very front, there are no other developments around, and there's woodlands for miles. The state put down some paths, so I suggested that we go exploring. We gear up, bring a pocket knife, spray down in bug spray, and head out. We hadn't explored too much, but I have a very good idea of the area, so we're gonna go off the trails. We're gonna be real men and forge our own path. We enter the woods, thickly forest with pine, maple and oak trees, and make notches in the trees so we can find our way back. It's around noon, so I'm not worried about it getting dark. After all, the sun sets at about 8 in the summer. We walk deeper and deeper into the woods. About 15 minutes and the forest is alive. Bugs, frogs, birds, everything. Slightly irritating to be honest, but I guess it's a nice change though. But soon, we stumble upon a peculiar scene, a perfect circle about 20 feet in diameter that spans around the ground all the way to the sky. I'm perplexed, but Andy is curious, so we decide to go in. The first thing I notice is that the overgrown weeds and grass that surround us stop at the perimeters. All vegetation also stops too. Now, that's pretty weird. I don't really see grass either. It's really odd. Now, being the middle of the summer, nothing should be dead here. I've never seen a branch behave like that. I'm feeling very uneasy. I turn to Andy and ask him if he feels uneasy too, and he says that he feels as though we're being watched. I agree. That's when we notice the strangest sense. The entire forest has gone silent, not in rest but in what feels like suspense. I'm feeling very uneasy now, and I know that we need to leave. We run out of the following and go to our tree markers, and suddenly within a second, it's alive again. The sounds, everything. We eventually make it back to safety, and we don't know what to make of what happened. It shouldn't be possible for the forest to be silent in the way that it was. I've never experienced anything in my life like it since. Literally one step is silence, then one step is sounds. We were never able to locate the circle again after. So I live in Kentucky, in the city now, but lived way out in the country when I was younger, in a very old giant farmhouse. My family got it for cheap because it was falling apart and the basement would flood and have crawfish infestations because it was so old. The basement floor was basically dirt and mud. I was also abducted at this house twice, but that's another story. Now my dad and I would go on walks across the property to our neighbour's pond to fish. He allowed us free access. This neighbour also owned a load of cattle. Now one day while walking there, at the top of a very tall tree, it had to be 50 feet off of the ground, there was a young calf quietly simply at the top of the branches. It hadn't been stormy for days. There's no way a tornado put it there. Now this was over 20 years ago, but I've never forgot that moment. I'm convinced that there's much more to this world we don't understand. This story isn't all that insane like a lot of other stories, but deeply unnerving to me. I was about 10, as a club scout. Every year to raise money, my troop sold popcorn, usually door to door. A leader, or one of our parents, would usually follow us in the car and drive us to different neighborhoods, so we're not completely alone while doing this. Often though, there weren't enough volunteers to come along, so the adult would wait at the end of the street and check up on us every half hour or so. I knocked on the door of this house near the woods. A woman answered the door, but didn't come out fully. Instead, she cracked the door open and looked at me and spoke to me through the crack. This wasn't particularly odd, as most people weren't sure what we're doing there at first. But the way she looked at me through the door was different. I somehow didn't notice anything at the time, but her face was only half exposed and completely horizontal, which meant she was standing completely behind the door for some reason. I started going through my standard sales pitch, going on about supporting the troop and on how high our quality popcorn is. But she stopped me in a low voice and said, "Oh dear, why don't you come inside and tell me more about this?" Thankfully, I was a big fan of scary stories as a kid, so alarm bells began ringing. I asked her why she didn't come outside fully, and her reply is in the same tone. "I have cancer, I can't." Now, I didn't know much about cancer back then, but it didn't sound like a symptom to me. Before I could say anything else, she said, "Are you alone? Are you with anyone else?" I replied that the Cub Scout leader was down the street, and as soon as she heard that, she shut the door and locked it without a sound. I was about 8 or 9 years old when this happened, placing it around 2005 or 6. At the time, I was living in Southwest Florida with my mum in a not so great part of town. So one day, my mum is driving me to a scout meeting for girls through the forest. I'm in the rear driver's side seat directly behind my mum. We're at a busy intersection in the turn lane waiting for the light to turn green for us to make a right. This guy comes running down the middle of the road, like literally running between cars on the main road. He's screaming, "Help! Help me please." My mum sees him in the rearview mirror on her side, and although she's in a good place to be a kind person, she's also cautious, so cracks down her window maybe 4 or 5 inches to see what's wrong, thinking maybe he's gotten into a car accident or something. Guy comes running up to my mother's window, shoves his arm into the car, almost up to his elbow. He's obviously trying to open the door or hit the power locks or windows to get in. My mum, being the badass she is, punches the crap out of this guy. And you can hear a pop and a crack sound. She must have broken at least one of his fingers. She rolls the windows up, crushing his fingers and more bones than I ever thought you could in an arm. Meanwhile, I'm in the backseat, petrified to move. He starts beating on the window, saying we better let him in or he's gonna kill us. At this point, the light turns green, and as soon as the car in front of us turned, my mum burned rubber to get out of there. We make it to the location for the scout meeting. By this time, I'm no longer in shock and start freaking out. I start crying a bit, but everything's okay. My mum calls the police department to let them know what happened, and we fled the scene. The officer informs her that someone's been robbed not even a block away from the intersection we're at. The suspect had fled on foot and eventually was caught, but the officer assumed that the man who tried to break into our car was the same one. At the time, I didn't think too deep into it. As I've got older, I started to think about it and just how dangerous it was. What if he was able to get in? What if he hurt my mum or me? What if he pulled out on my mum's driver's seat and drove away, or maybe had a weapon? Last summer, I was camping with my partner and our 30-pound dog alone in a creek in a popular area in a nearby national forest. It was an established site, but not a campground. Parking spot, fire ring, nice flat area with access to the creek. Now in the dead of night, we're awoken by a large truck parked by our car just idling. Eventually 3 men get out, they enter our camp. They're talking quietly. The truck and creek makes us unable to hear anything they're saying. I'm pretty sure it's not good now. Meanwhile, our dog has been growling in a low tone the entire time. Early on, I whispered to my partner to be quiet and hold the dog and hide. I got out of our sleeping bag, put my shoes on. The only thing I had for defense was a forest axe, halfway between a hatchet and axe. Very useful for getting by in the woods. I had a leather sheath with a metal button latch to protect the blade. Now they took their time, perhaps as intimidation, but eventually got closer to our tent. I loudly popped the metal button for the latch, taking the sheath off, preparing to become an axe murderer. Or maybe be murdered myself, apparently. All 3 of the men hear the latch. My assumption is they thought it's a gun holster, quickly left the camp, getting in their trucks and leaving without a word. I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains. On the side of one of the mountains that borders the valley of the town, it's a lovely place for an outdoorsy kid. We have no immediate neighbours and acres of woods to play in. Above our house was a ridge that ran along the border of a state park, but all the trails and public areas were far in the valley below, separated by a thick forest with plenty of no trespassing signs. So we very rarely had hikers crossing over onto our land. From our home, there was a dirt road that wound up the mountainside to the top of the ridge. Where there stood the remains of a burnt down cabin. From there, you could follow the ridge to a flat area with Dad's hunting friends, one of whom posted a trail cam to monitor off-season activity. From there, you could continue up the ridge to a clearing that hosted lots of flat boulders and a giant electric tower that was fun to climb on. I'd venture up there often with the family's black Labrador, spending hours reading, climbing and enjoying nature. One early fall day when I was 13, I headed up there with a backpack full of snacks and a book. I'd taken care to avoid the trail cam, as it was the old film variety, and I gotten in trouble for accidentally filling entire rolls with me goofing around in the area. I reached my favourite rock at the edge of the clearing near the power lines, and just settled down to read when Felicia started to bark and growl aggressively. At first, I paid no attention to it, as she loves to chase deer, but this time, she didn't bound off into the woods after her quarry. Instead, she snuck up next to me growling at something unseen in the thick tangle of brush and trees on the steep mountainside that faces a park. Now, I'd consider hiking down that way into the park on occasion, but it wasn't an easy passage. The area had been cleared years before to install an electrical tower, and in its place had grown a thick mass of bulbs and weeds. The rocks that were made great for climbing are on top of the ridge. Not to mention, there was much easier access closer to the park entrance. This brought you down to an undeveloped area at the very back of the campgrounds that wasn't easily accessible to cars or hikers. So I was taken off guard to see a man fighting his way through the brush in that direction. Nervously I called out hello, gripped Felicia's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she gets excited, and I didn't want to tumble her down the mountain. I'd overheard my parents arguing about lawsuits when she borrowed a jogger over the trail park. The man smiles, coughs, and makes his way up the hill to the base of my rock. I don't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him, or the rather remote and impassable way that he'd come from, but his presence made me uneasy. He seemed normal and friendly enough. He was probably in his mid to late 20s, average height and build. Rather unremarkable looking. No backpack or supplies, but he was dressed as a hiker would be. He didn't like the way he looked at me, although, in my young age, I couldn't place why it unsettled me. As a grown woman, I can look back and realize how he was sizing me up. He had a big smile on his face too. "Hi there. Where'd you come from?" No trace of an accent. Sticking out to me as odd. Our people have a strong regional accent, and we don't get any outsiders here. I live just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog. "She seems like a nice dog," he told me, with no trace of irony. Felicia starts snarling and vibrating with menace, but he seems unfazed. Weird again. "You should have her on a leash though, you don't want to get in trouble." I say we put her on a leash and we're down in the park, but this is our property. No reaction to learning he was essentially trespassing. "Still, you're so close, you don't know who you might run up on here." I said no one comes up here, being a bit rude. He said I'm from the park, grinning. "I'm one of the park rangers, and I wanted to see the property." "What would you have done if she'd attacked me? You get in big trouble." At this time, I'm immediately chilled. We only had one ranger, and he was a close friend of the family. This guy was not him. But I was afraid to let on that I knew he was lying, so I dug out Felicia's collar and clipped her on the leash. "Sorry, we'll let you get on with the hike, I have to go home," he says. "Your parents know you're up here." "Oh yeah, they expect me home soon." "Do they often come here?" "Well, my dad does. He comes up to check on the trail cams." "Trail cams?" "Yeah, there's loads up here." He smiled but looks cold. "Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds." He took a step towards me and Felicia lunged, nearly yanking the leash out of my hands. I managed to haul her back in time. His smile was gone. "You should head back," I say, keeping a tight hold on the leash. "Now, maybe I'll see you up here again sometime." "Yeah, maybe," I said, secretly thinking to myself that I'd never step foot in the woods again. "Well, bye." I quickly dragged Felicia away, looking back over my shoulder every now and then. He remains motionless in the spot where I'd left him, staring after me with that same smile. Once he was out of sight, I picked up the pace. Felicia growled over her shoulder a few times, and occasionally I heard branches snap behind me, but glancing back, I saw no sign of him following. I cut straight across the clearing with the trail cam, not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we hit the road that led home, I unclipped Felicia from the leash and broke into a jog. She remained by my side until I got home. I didn't mention the strange man to my parents at first. They're very wary of me going hiking alone, and I knew I wouldn't be let out if I said it. By the time I got home, I convinced myself that I'd overreacted to the whole thing. He's probably just a hiker and made up the bit about being a ranger to mess with me. Still, I didn't hike up to that ridge that week, instead sticking to the woods nearby. At the end of the week though, I came home from school to an annoyed dad demanding to know if I'd mess with the trail cam. His buddy had actually come up to collect the film, discovering the cameras switched off, with a few frames taken off. At first I was only concerned with getting in trouble and desperately professed innocence, and then I remembered the stranger. After telling Dad about him, he calls the park ranger to ask if there was a new ranger we didn't know about. He said no, but after hearing my story, he told Dad the campground attendant who caught an out-of-stater overnighting in an unauthorized area back behind the campground the previous weekend. He'd assumed the guy was trying to get out of paying the fee. Young guy, average looking, overly friendly. He said it was a mistake and took off. Shortly after, we heard from Dad's buddy with the trail cam. He got on the roll developed, even though there's only a few frames still filled up. The last one is of me and Felicia cutting across a clearing. Thank God I told the stranger there's multiple cams. I imagine he'd given up after locating the other ones. My parents have since moved into a little snug neighbourhood down in the valley. I moved out of town. In my parents' backyard, on the river, there's a mound covered by Easter lilies that marks Felicia's final resting place. The house I grew up in fell into despair and was sold and essentially burned to the ground. No one lives there now, but the clearing at the top is still popular with hunters. When I visit, I still hike up that ridge and always bring a dog with me. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I are in the middle of a crossroad trip. We're driving through Texas. Now, for any of you who have driven through Texas, you would have known how big the state actually is. Sometimes you'll go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of very much. Maybe an old rusty petrol station, a few little houses. Looking out the window, you'd swear you're driving through the same desert over and over again. I actually started getting a headache, and my husband suggested I took a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The swaying of the car awoke in me. Now, the first thing I noticed is the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The swaying of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed is how dark it is. I believe it's around 10 PM. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food, asking if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while when I went to the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms are a little down the hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realised how badly I need to pee. So I shuffled into the restroom, made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest 2 stalls. I then make eye contact with a woman coming out of the other stall. She doesn't look quite homeless, but she was definitely a mess. Her hair was wild and grey, almost shoulder length if I hadn't been looking carefully. It looked as though she hadn't seen a brush for months. She wore ragged looking clothes, a pair of ill-fitting blackout shorts, and I remember noticing her foam flip-flops. She has several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind this is Texas in July. The jacket is hanging out over her shoulders like she hadn't taken it off properly. She was carrying something in a tied up grocery bag. I gave her a quick smile as our eyes met. She just stares at me in return. Then the face turns wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as though she's angry, but her eyes looked alive and wild. She looked at me like she's hungry. This made me feel that something was wrong with her. I try and brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd. She was standing with her body angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as though she is ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face, like you would be at a mirror. I wasn't sure why, but I felt uncomfortable. Now I regretted leaving my purse and things away from me, with my cell phone in it. I shut the door, locking the store behind me using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally I heard the smacking of her flip-flops on her way to the door. I heard it open and slam close. The door was pretty heavy, having actually slammed the same way when I entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed a wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, then paused. Fingers only inches away from the lock. I'm now silent as I can manage to be, and yes, I hear breathing. The woman pretended to leave. At this point I was scared and confused. Why she tried to trick me into thinking she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible. I knew something was wrong, so I stayed in the store even longer. This time it must have been about 20 minutes. I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from. She positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her. Finally I hear her leave. This time I waited a few minutes to make sure she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall quickly, washing my hands and rushing down the hallway to the store. It's pitch black outside. I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out behind the door. Sure enough, crouched right outside of the door is the woman, surprised as she stands and turns away to the side of the store, walking quickly. My husband's waiting in the car and says am I okay, as I took a while. I said I'd say about it when we got away from the store. Easily the most scary experience of my life. My family had a small acreage of farms in Canadian pastures. It is not too far out from our city, but far enough that it's very rare to have unexpected visitors. At the time, we had some sheep and chickens, but it wasn't a huge farm. It was just my mum, my dad, my sister and I. My sister was 5 years older than me, so only 7 at the time. We also had a sweet dog named Maggie. My parents has always said that she is the best farm dog we ever had. She was special, very sweet with other animals and kids. She never barked or got upset without a good reason, much unlike our last puppy who would bark at the wind. My dad was out of town this particular night, probably visiting my grandparents in his town down south. My mum was alone with just us little guys, and Maggie was sleeping soundly in the porch. So my mum woke up in the middle of the night to Maggie growling. My mum's a pretty light sleeper, so it doesn't take much to wake her up, but this was very unusual behaviour for our puppy. My mum thought it was probably an animal, so she took a peek outside. Sometimes coyotes or large bucks would upset Maggie, so that was the most likely explanation. However, it wasn't the case on this night. Our farm is right adjacent to the highway, and there's a long, unlit lane that leads into our yard. It wasn't obvious at first, but my mum saw a dark vehicle slowly creeping down the lane. The car's headlights were shut off, and we didn't have a lot of light in the yard. My mum's stomach immediately sunk. Anyone with good intentions wouldn't shut off their headlights. She also had 2 little kids in the house that she had to protect. She watched them slowly creep into the yard. I don't know how many there were, but at least a couple of guys got out of the vehicles, then heading towards a shop where my dad keeps his tools, tractor, etc. Now at the time, there was a big power panel on the side that controlled all the electricity to the yard lights in the house. They opened it up and started to go through it, evidently trying to figure out how to shut off the power. God knows what their intentions were. Luckily, my family has a hunting rifle, and my mum grew up on farms, so she knew how to use one. Now she quietly pops open the door, just enough to stick the barrel out and fire a warning shot in their direction. They freaked out and hopped back into their vehicle, reversing all the way down the lane so that she couldn't see their license plate. I honestly have no idea what these guys' intentions were. Maybe simply rob us, but the idea of multiple people pulling into the yard with no lights on, shutting off the power, is terrifying. Either way, I'm extremely grateful for our sweet Maggie and my mum for keeping us safe. It's been 21 years since that happened. I pray I never see them again. When I was younger, I used to live on a house that was surrounded by farmland. It meant we had very few neighbours and very little to do. Now, I was scared of the dark. This phobia didn't fade away until I became an adult. The thing I hated most about living here was being bored, and if I had to walk home at night, because there were no street lamps obviously, only the moonlight if you were lucky. There's one incident that my mum later told me about that terrifies me to this day. More the fact that this happened and I was completely oblivious to it. Apparently when I was 7 years old, I was asleep in my room one day when it was snowing outside. Now there was mysteriously footprints leading into and around our house, but there never seemed to be anybody else there to make them. What's more strange is how that they seemingly vanished after a point, like someone had literally floated away. My dad was always skeptical of this and thought it was someone playing a prank on us. Now apparently, I would always complain about seeing a strange person at my window and talking to them, which at first my mum and dad shook off as me being paranoid and my imagination playing tricks on me as I was scared of the dark. Well, apparently I went on about this for months until eventually my dad decided to sleep in my room with me, and lo and behold, I woke him up saying that man's there again. My dad said don't worry and to go back to sleep. He then rolled over, and to his horror, he saw a man peering in at me watching me sleep. He got up immediately, grabbed his rifle, called my mum to go and get some help, and rushed outside, but unfortunately the man was gone. Now this is in the day before you really had camera systems in your home. What we did do is buy a really big guard dog that stayed in the front of the house, and after that, he never returned. Stranger danger was something my mum was hyper vigilant about telling us of. She had always warned us about the horse farm down the road from us, and the weird people that lived there. Well, it is about a mile away, and I usually was only that far from home if I was on my bike with a group, so I wasn't really concerned. One day, I was walking in my neighbourhood when some neighbours I didn't know well began speaking to me. While we knew most of our immediate neighbours, this couple lived on a street perpendicular to ours, and I only interacted with them at Halloween, if that. I was probably 7 or 8, and they told me they were giving a trampoline away. And boy, had I always wanted a trampoline. Begging my parents to get one for years. I was over the moon. I told them I'd have to ask my parents, so surprisingly though, they told me I could have it. It was in the backyard waiting for me, but not to come back with my parents. I thought this was a little strange, and I didn't listen to them about not getting my parents. I wanted a trampoline. Now my dad is a totally oblivious person, so apparently when I told him this, it didn't raise a red flag. He came along with me to ask about the trampoline. We knock on their door and wait on their footsteps, but no one comes. I was annoyed. I really wanted one. Now years later, reflecting on the event, I realised that there's a small fenced field, and that's where they'd ride the horses sometimes. I once even pet the horse and admired the owner as she rode. I didn't think of it as a farm, aside from the one horse and fenced in area. It seemed to be a normal yard to me, so my mother's warnings are in vain. I shudder thinking about what would have happened if I'd gone to the home alone. Thankfully I had more sense. Though at the time I didn't realise how close I was to danger. Just how close I was to having a trampoline. My dad ended up looking in through the windows and he could actually see them hiding, waiting for me. We never went around that area again and reported it to the police. Growing up, I lived in a farmer's house. My dad and most of my family were all farmers, so growing up around nature was a normal thing to me. Now we had a problem with crows and other animals trying to eat all of our crops, so we put up multiple scarecrows around the house where we lived. Now I was always paranoid of them as a child. I used to tell my mum stories about how they would move. Of course, she just thought it was my imagination running wild and never thought anything of it. That was until one day she saw one move too. After constantly complaining, my mum and dad eventually switched rooms with me and would let me sleep in their room. My mum said it was one moonlit night where she was laying in bed unable to sleep. She got up and decided to go and make a drink in the kitchen. As she was looking out the window, she was sure that she saw something move. Confused by this and a little groggy, she decided to go back to bed and try and get some sleep. When she got back to her bedroom, she was sure it's just her mind playing tricks on her, so she gone back to sleep. However, she heard constant sounds outside and knew something was up. She then goes back to the kitchen to get a better look, and what she sees terrifies her. Because of the moonlight, she can see the reflection off of 2 pieces of glass. After closer inspection, she can tell that these are a pair of binoculars. My mum let out a blood-curdling scream at this point. That's what I remember, and my dad telling me to stay in my room and not move. He quickly grabs his hunting rifle and fires a warning shot into the sky. What's more crazy is that whoever was watching us with the binoculars didn't even move. By the time my dad had gotten his dog and went outside, whoever this was long gone. What he did find is truly harrowing. Upon closer inspection of where my mum saw this figure, she could see some old tattered clothes that appeared to be almost identical to what our scarecrows were wearing. This sick person decided to imitate a scarecrow in order to spy on us. We very quickly after moved houses, and I only learnt about this story in my adult life in order not to scare me. And to be honest, I'm thankful that they never told me at the time, because that would have truly terrified me. I'm originally from a state where it's predominantly hot all year. I'm not a big fan of warm weather, so when winter comes I have my windows open and spend as much time as possible outside. Temperatures average around the 50s, but that's besides my point. We live close to lots of fields and have lots of open space around us. It was one of those chilly winter nights. I was about 10 years old, and the only people home were two nannies and me. They were at the other side of the home watching TV, while I was in my room. It's getting late, likely around 10 PM, so I decide to take a shower, hopping into bed. Everything's fine. I hop out of the shower, getting ready for bed. At this point I should quickly go over the layout of my room. It's rectangular and has two windows facing the front door entrance to my home. From my windows you can see a walkway to the front door, and the path is sort of gated in brick. Basically, you have to enter the driveway, then turn left and walk down a path that leads to my front door. My bed faces one of those windows, and all I can see all the way down is a path. Both windows have a mesh screen. This is where things get scary. Like I mentioned earlier, I had the window facing my bed open to let the cool air in. My room was well lit, so it's hard to see anything through the window. However, as soon as I turned off the light, I see the figure of a man with his face pressed up against the screen. In that moment, I felt his piercing gaze, his motionless smiling. He had facial hair that looked as though his whole face was covered in fur, and the hair on his head was the same length. I briefly thought I'd imagined this and was seeing something that wasn't actually there. Now, I'd taken a couple of quick steps back towards the window to get a closer look to confirm what I saw was real. It was. This all happened in a matter of seconds. I bolted out of the room towards my room where my nannies are. The hallway in the house is very narrow and long, and there's large windows facing the entrance. I didn't dare look out. I reached my room where my nannies are in and tell them what happened, and they just laughed at me. To be quite honest, it was a boy who cried wolf situation. I always played pranks on them, so it's hard for me to be taken seriously. I had to beg them to come check with me, from which I can remember they took seriously. When we get to my room, there's no one there. My window screen is left untouched and the man is gone. I don't think they were totally convinced, and neither were my parents. I couldn't sleep in my room for days because of the incident, and nothing was done about it. My house didn't even have an alarm system, so there was nothing stopping them coming back. I'm still very disappointed how the situation was handled. I had no power at all. I have no idea how long the guy was out there for watching me, and if he showed up again after. I remember how messed up his smile was, how menacing it was. I'm glad that I was not harmed by this man and that it was only a visit. I at least hope. I stopped opening my windows at night, and I now get paranoid when I feel the cold air at night time. As someone who has grown up on an infamous haunted plantation, I've never actually been scared of ghosts. Curious and intrigued, yes. Scared? Never. In fact, I've gone through a lot of trouble just to go to a haunted house or location. I lived in Virginia, so there's lots of places to go to up in the forests. There has only been one incident that scared me so bad I'll never ghost hunt again. When this particular event happened, I was 19, and me and my boyfriend were exploring. We made it a thing to go around at midnight to go ghost hunting at random places. He lived in Williamsburg, VA, so there were lots of places to go. We would go around the Newport area as well. Some famous places that we visited often were Old Housewoods, Crawford Road, Roswell House, etc. One night we decided we're bored and we wanted to go out with a group of friends and do ghost hunting. We got 3 of our friends on board and get ready to head out for the night. We usually make sure we're nice and toasty when we get to our destination, stand in the warm for a while before. We decided to check out Roswell. Then on our way back home, we're going to take a detour through Crawford Road. The night started out really fun. We basically couldn't stop laughing the entire night. One of my friends, on the other hand, couldn't shake this bad feeling. He insisted that we go home or get some food at a fast food place. He was also insisting that we skip Crawford Road because it was too out of the way from their apartment complex. I was very insistent that we checked out Crawford Road. Since my boyfriend was driving, it didn't matter. We jumped back in the car, get some McDonald's and head over to Crawford. Crawford Bridge is just this little bridge on a very desolate, creepy road. If I remember correctly, the road's about 10 miles long. The bridge was where they would go to hang people, and ghost sightings are common. So we got on Crawford Road. We decided that we could get out of the car to take a better look. Now I remind you it's about 1:30 AM. I'm not scared, but get scared of the idea of what happened here previously. At the time I thought my friend being scared all of a sudden was strange, because he usually loved doing this stuff. He kept on saying he had a bad feeling. He had a bad feeling and that he always trusts his gut. Now we should have listened. We were all too stubborn and are almost on the bridge. Right as we come around the corner to the bridge, we see a car just park on the side of the road. As we get a little closer to the car came on the same side of the road as us. We assumed it's some teenagers checking out the landmark like we were, but as we're about to pass them, I see the outline of 2 older men. I did see that they were both bald, sending chills down my spine, so I tell my boyfriend keep on driving. He agreed that we shouldn't get out or stop. So we passed slowly, but when we were about to turn the corner to the bridge to be out of view, I saw that the car slowly turned around, turns on his high beams and starts following us. At first, we're a little freaked out, but you know, coincidences happen. About 2 miles down the road, the car's right on our tail. We decide to go faster than normal to lose him. The speed limit on the road was 30 to 40 miles an hour. We're going 65 just to try and shake the car. The whole time the car was so close to ours, it's almost touching. At this point, we're all officially freaked out. My friend who was originally freaking out was now in tears. We officially were being chased by these guys. I felt a lot of relief when I saw that there's a turn onto a highway ahead. There are almost no cars on the road, so we didn't even stop for the stop sign. We ran right through it, and so does a car behind us. We saw a 711 up ahead, and we thought if we turn into it, that they would just keep going and leave us alone. But no, they decided to follow us right into the 711 parking lot. We would be the only ones in the parking lot together, and at the time, I didn't think any of us wanted to come face to face with the mysterious bald man. My boyfriend then unexpectedly punched it out of the parking lot, follows the mysterious car. At this point, we're all honestly thinking we're about to die. We had no idea what the intentions were of these people, but we knew obviously it's not good, and we've been specifically targeted. Once we got on the road, we're going at easily 100. We're all screaming, and I managed to call the police, but I was in hysterics going 100 miles an hour in an area I'm not used to. At some point, the car got from behind us and into the other lane. I look over, thought I saw a flash of something metallic coming up in their window. Then suddenly my boyfriend slams on the brakes. The other car keeps going 100 as we quickly turn around. When I look back, I see them doing the same thing. But by the time that they've turned around, we're already flying in the opposite direction. Somehow, I'm not sure how, but we lost them. We try and find the most populated area that we could. Once we found a random apartment complex, we stopped the car and are all crying. My friend who told us we shouldn't go yelling at us. He's going on about how you need to trust your instincts. Let me tell you, I've never not trusted them since. This happened 10 plus years ago, so I'm paraphrasing for all parties. Now it's not the creepiest story, but unsettling to say the least. My dad and I were hiking on this mountain trail that was super steep and treacherous. No exaggeration, at some points I was legitimately worried I'd fall to my death if I even took the wrong step. It wasn't a super long hike, but super challenging one. Eventually we made it to the top. We had brought food with us, so we sat down and started snacking. Maybe 10 minutes later, this guy comes out of this bush. A lone bush. He literally came out. So obvious he was hiding there. Let me just say, I'm not trying to sound rude, but this guy was huge. An unhealthily large man. My first thought was, how did that guy make it up here? Again, not trying to be rude. I was genuinely curious as to how he made it up here. I was out of breath, and so was my dad. The guy was not, though. Interaction goes like this. Guys, hey, can I sit with you guys? Before we could answer, he sat down on the rock next to us and starts talking. He was asking the most cliche creepy questions like, where do you guys live? How old are you? Are you married? Now I was 13 at the time, and you're pretty. My dad immediately stands up, gives me a head nod like, move behind him or away from him. Tells the guy he wants to spend some time with his daughter. My dad was super polite, but I could tell he was thrown off. We start moving our area, and the guy says, hey, screw you, aggressively towards my dad. My dad says something along the lines of, watch your mouth, my kid's here. We did have a rifle on us, but that didn't seem to register to the guy. He definitely saw it though, it's on my dad's back. The guy just sat there on the rock and would not go away. He was staring us down. In his defense, there wasn't really anywhere for him to go except back into the bush or down the mountain. He kept staring. He honestly gave me the most uneasy feeling. This situation was classic horror movie stuff. My first thought is that he was mentally disabled in some way, or mentally disturbed, and was probably harmless. But after we moved, he started threatening us, saying stuff like, "I'll beat the crap out of you, you won't speak to me like that." That's when alarms really start going off. The situation escalates pretty quickly thereafter, so my dad takes a rifle off his back and whispers to me to stand up and walk down the mountain. He'll be right behind me. The next part is from hearing movement and footsteps because I was following my dad's order, but I could hear the guy starting after my dad, asking why were they leaving. My dad turns around and screams at him to back off. I hear the click from the safety and thought, is this seriously happening now? He wasn't trying to be bad, the gun was for bears, but the guy eventually backs off. My dad called up to me and said everything's fine and just keep going. We made it back to the car, locked the doors and drove out of there fast. To this day, I don't know how he got up there. People hunt on the other parts of the mountain and hike there during the appropriate seasons. You cannot legally live there. God knows how long he'd been there and what his intentions were. I'm just glad that my dad had a rifle. That guy was really like a bear. My friends and I decided to take my girlfriend at the time to see this beautiful nature area, deciding to go to a national park about an hour and a half away from where I actually lived. This place is definitely no sort of secret location. It's very well known, but there's a ton of different areas to it, all with different rural and windy roads taking you to various areas of the park. We'd gone in 2 different cars. We'd finished out by a day of hiking and were heading down to one of the less common roads. Now I remembered seeing this really beaten up 70s sedan with a wild looking dude in the driver's seat driving past us in the opposite direction. This isn't uncommon as there's a lot of smaller, less economically sound towns scattered around the area. But for some reason, his car stood out. My girlfriend notices it as well. About 200 meters further down the windy road, there's a pull-off area. There was a camper van belonging to a company that mostly rented out colourful vans to backpackers parked there with a woman standing in front of it. As soon as she sees us, she jumps out to the road and flags us down. Now I've read enough of these to know what to do, and know that pulling in might not be the safest idea. Though I ignore this and decide to pull over, knowing my friends are behind. Luckily she wasn't the person I didn't want to meet. She was quite obviously upset and scared when I pull in. I told my girlfriend to wait in the car, and I got out to speak to her. She's almost in tears. I can't remember where she was from, but a Central European country from memory. Touring around with her 4 or 5-year-old daughter, she told me her van had broken down, and she had pulled over there and called the van company's assistant line for help. By this time my friends had pulled up behind us to see what's up. Apparently a weird man had been driving past her a few times, first pulling over to offer to take her and her daughter to the nearest town for help, but thanking him and saying no, that she's waiting for assistance. He left, but then he kept driving past her every 10 or 15 minutes in the opposite direction, slowing down, looking at them driving off. She begged us to stay with her while we waited for the assistant vehicle. The guy terrified them. I agreed. My friends, being the awesome people they are, decided to take me and my girlfriend and ditch us. Thanks, guys. We wait with this woman for a little while before the car and my girlfriend I'd seen earlier drove past, kind of slowing down in the opposite direction. As soon as he'd driven around the corner, the lady says that's him, and he's been here so many times before. This got my girlfriend and I to take her much more seriously now, as we got the same feeling from that guy. A few moments later he came back from the opposite direction and pulls into the parking lot. For some context, I'm not an intimidating man. I'm tallish, but I have almost zero muscle and soft features, so there's not at all intimidating features on me. There's a terrified foreign woman, her daughter, and my girlfriend. So parked off in a quiet, secluded rural location, and there's some creepy dude coming up to us. Great. He gets out and is redneck as hell and definitely not friendly looking. No judgment on the redneck part. I come from a poorer country, from our city, and those are my people, but hopefully that sets a picture. At some point I walk towards him to put myself between them. He looks at the girls and me, saying, "Can he have help?" I say no. We're just waiting for the assistance vehicle and we've got it covered. He then says maybe he could stay and wait, so I don't have to. I tell him we're happy to stay and it's good. He kind of just stood there for a while staring at us. He didn't really say anything, just gives me creepy vibes. After what feels like an eternity, another car drove past us and kept on going. This startles him. He mumbles something and rushes off to his car. We waited with this woman for another 90 minutes and see him multiple times just driving past. The vehicle assistant guy finally arrives. I asked to see his ID to be safe and everything's good. She was really grateful and texted me thanking me later for staying with her. The thing I didn't like about this was how the guy had come back multiple times after being told to go away. Even if he was being nice, he would have had common sense to know that he has to leave, but clearly he had different intentions. Somebody actually got kidnapped from the same area months later. I'm just glad I was there to hopefully prevent this from happening. During the summer when I was a kid, I used to stay with my grandma for several days at a time. One week when I was 12, it was just my grandma and I in her home for 5 days. She owns a small handgun. The whole family knows she's not afraid to use it when push comes to shove. So one night, we both went to bed earlier than usual at about 11 PM. I woke up very early since there was no alarm clock in my room. I pulled the blinds looking out of the window, which was right next to me, to see what time of day it is. Now it's very dark. It was a rural town, so there's no cars, neighbours or streetlights. So I guessed that it's somewhere between 2 and 4 AM. A few seconds after I closed the blinds, I heard a deep male voice whisper, "Psst, hey, you." I knew that the voice come from outside the window. The room I slept in was on the opposite end of the house as my grandma's room. But since her house is pretty small, she could have heard me and woken up if I yelled. However, I was paralyzed with fear. I was actually able to convince myself that it did not happen by telling myself, "Oh, you were half asleep. It's probably your imagination." And sat still in my bed for an hour staring at the door. I was, however, eventually able to fall asleep and had a nightmare of a man running into my room. I immediately woke up. It was dawn, and I had gathered up enough courage to run to my grandma's room. We looked around the house for a short amount of time, and we judged that the man was long gone, and I went back to bed and woke up a few hours later. My mum was talking to my grandma in the living room, ready to take me home because it was my last day. When I walk into the room, my grandma told me what she saw on the news before I wake up again. A convict was being transported to a new prison and had escaped from the transport less than a mile from the home. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. At the time, every house there literally had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself is very beautiful. I'm now 21, live in a bustling city in Alberta. I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by unsettling memories of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home alone by myself, as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived literally only a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province for months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and the odd bit of forest exploring. This night I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in. Usually up a large rock formation, I like to climb and look through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt frightened or scared being there. It felt like my own private place I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual position, I suddenly heard a sound from further in. It wasn't natural at all. Crying. Fake crying sounding like a child, maybe even an infant relentlessly crying. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying is the last thing that I expected to hear in the forest. I must have listened to it for a good few times, convinced my ears are playing tricks on me, but no, in fact, this is crying. In my mind, I imagined it's a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest needing help. I considered going back to the home and calling my mother to help, but though I'm worried the girl was going to be beyond earshot, I decided to locate her on my own. Now, I made my way hastily through the trees and branches trying to figure out the exact destination the girl was crying in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought. It's a matter of trial and error to make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realised while doing this is just how consistent the crying is, literally non-stop. What I did notice was that the closer I get to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing with some trees and bushes on either side and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I'd ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take that long for me to find the source of the sound. A grade 8 recorder, one of the biggest I'd ever seen. I was peeking out, looking around and seeing no one. I now see the crying sounds coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I went all the way in expecting a real person, not a tape recorder. I was about to shut it off when I hear another sound coming from outside. It sounds as though footsteps are advancing in my direction. It only took a tall shadowy figure coming at me to make me shoot out of there. I was worried I wouldn't find my way back, but fortunately, by some miracle, I recognised my way back by identifying rocks and trees as landmarks. Looking back, this would have saved my life. I never looked back. I just kept going. I can tell that I'm being followed for the first part of this. I just kept telling myself I have to make it home no matter what. Once I saw a large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without seeing the surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran to my home, locking and shutting the door. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would have been done for. After shutting the curtains at my window, I peek out through them as discreetly as I can. I can't see anyone and I wait there for a good hour. It eventually gets dark. After this I go straight to bed. I never told my mum about what happened and I never went to them woods again.